Good morning. You're listening to the Indie Truth Show on Revolution Broadcasting at revolutionbroadcasting.com. I'm your host, Doug Gaking. In just a few moments here, we'll have John Perkins on the line, author of the New York Times bestselling book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I'm just going to go ahead and call him up and get him waiting on the phone here. Thanks for tuning in today. John Perkins is, as I said, the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and his more recent book is The Secret History of the American Empire. Welcome to the Indie Truth Show, John Perkins. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here. Nice to be with you, Doug. Thanks for having me on board.
Great. I introduced you and your books. The first thing I'd like to have you share with our listeners, many of them haven't read your book yet. I've been talking to a lot of them this week. So I'd like to have you explain a little bit about what your job was as an economic hitman.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire. And for the first time in history, we've created an empire primarily without the military, through economics. We work many different ways, but perhaps the most common is that we will identify a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. However, the money doesn't actually go to that country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, highways, industrial parks, things that will benefit a few very wealthy families in that country, as well as our corporations, but don't help the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity or have cars for the highways or they don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks. But the whole country, is left holding a huge debt. And it's such a big debt that they can't possibly repay it. So at some point we go back to them and we say, listen, you owe us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq. On the few occasions when we fail, and I talk in my books about how I failed with Jaime Roldos, the president of Ecuador, and Omar Torrijos of Panama. When we fail, when I was unable to corrupt these presidents, to get them to accept these outrageous loans, then the jackals go in. And these are people who will either overthrow the governments or assassinate the leaders who didn't play our game. And I talk in the book again about how that happens in both Ecuador and Panama on my watch. On the very few occasions when both the economic hitmen and the jackals fail, is what happened in Iraq. Then and only then does the military go in. And in this way, we've really created a clandestine empire. Most people in the United States don't realize that we've been doing this. They think we're defending democracy around the world, which we're not doing at all. And I think this is a very disturbing thing, Doug. I think it really has to make us question our whole role as a democracy, because a democracy is based on the assumption that you have an informed electorate. If the electorate doesn't understand this most basic part of our foreign policy, then we're not informed. And if we're not informed, it's hard to say that we can truly vote democratically. And that's why I write these books. And a lot of other people are writing books and making movies about things like this now, so that the American people will understand better.
Yeah, and I think a great example of how that has worked has been in Saudi Arabia. You talked about that in the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I know, where the United States, in order to get more oil from that country and have a little more influence in how they distribute their oil, sent you guys in to try to set up a system where through these agreements and loans, or actually it wasn't loans, I think, in that case, but still a similar agreement where these private corporations make a country like Saudi Arabia dependent on the United States for services, and then what they did was, and then the United States was able to get military cooperation with them, and now we send billions of dollars worth of military aid into Saudi Arabia. Is that correct?
So that's very true, and this really began in the early 70s. There was this oil embargo in the United States because OPEC wasn't happy with our policies in Israel. They shut off the oil supply here. We had huge lines at gas stations. People were afraid that we were going to go into another depression like that in the 30s. And so the Treasury Department came to me, another economic hitman, and said, listen, you got to do something so that OPEC can't hold us up to hostage again. And we knew that to do anything like that, we had to deal with Saudi Arabia because they had more oil than anyone else. And the House of Saud, the royal family, was corrupt and corruptible. And so we struck this deal with the House of Saud. And the long version's described in some detail in Confessions and Secret History, but the short version is that the House of Saud agreed that they would basically return almost all the money they made from selling oil around the world to the United States and invest it in U.S. government securities, which they've done, incidentally. And the interest from those government securities would be used by the Treasury Department to hire U.S. corporations to westernize Saudi Arabia, build petrochemical plants there, build desalination plants, highways, ports, in fact, build whole cities from the desert, essentially using Saudi's money to hire U.S. corporations to westernize Saudi Arabia, which we've done. And the part of the deal also was that Saudi Arabia would agree not to sell oil on the international market for anything other than dollars, which put the dollar in a very powerful position. And our part of the bargain was that we agreed to keep the House of Saud in power, defending them however it was necessary. And we've done that. Everybody's kept their part of the deal up until the current time. It was a very, very important deal for the corporatocracy, for those who really run this new empire.
Do you think that this westernization of Saudi Arabia contribute a lot to the blowback that we've seen through the creation of Al-Qaeda and the rise of Osama bin Laden?
No question about it. And Osama bin Laden has gone on the record stating that he's very distressed by the fact that Saudi Arabia has become so westernized that Mecca and Medina, the two most sacred cities in Islam, are surrounded by oil wells and petrochemical plants and Americanized cities. There's no question about that. And also the fact that Saudi had struck this deal, basically returning most of the money they made to the United States, and put their oil at our disposal.
Okay, let's move over, I guess, next door to Iraq. You mentioned it a little bit in your introduction to economic hitmen and what they do. How did we get into this situation in Iraq? Why is the United States fighting a war over there right now?
Well, after this incredible deal that we struck with Saudi Arabia, we figured we should strike a similar deal with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Iraq controlled the second largest oil supply in the world, and we figured if we had the two of them tied up, Saudi Arabia and Iraq, we'd have total control. But Saddam would not accept such a deal. I'm not even sure why, but he didn't accept it. And so we sent in the Jackals to take him out, but they couldn't. He had very good security forces, and he had a lot of double lookalikes, which makes it tough to assassinate a guy. And so in 91 we sent the military in. And, of course, the military wiped out his military, and we thought at that point that he would be sufficiently chastised, that he would now come around to our way of thinking. Economic hitmen went back in the 90s and went against Saddam, did not buy. The Jackals went in again, couldn't take him out. So we sent the military in again in this war that we've got now, which is a terrible, terrible disaster, terrible fiasco. So, has encouraged terrorism, has, opened the doors for Iran to basically threaten all of the Middle East. Up until then, Iraq was the main, Saddam's army was the main deterrent against Iran, but we managed to do the greatest, give Iran the greatest gift we possibly could by taking out Saddam's army. So, it was a real fiasco, but that all came from the fact that we wanted Saudi Arabia to accept a similar deal. We wanted Iraq to accept a similar deal to Saudi Arabia, and Saddam would not do it.